This is the Western Hemisphere. And there really are two big countries in the Western Hemisphere, Brazil and the United States. Brazil, the largest in South America, the United States, the largest in North America. You can't talk about Mexico without talking about the United States. You can't talk about national development or international relations without talking about regions. So the United States, we're part of it. Secondly, I want to just talk about, I want to stress, and I will stress, this big issue in development, which is avoiding the middle income trap. I raised it when the president of the Inter-American Development Bank was here. A number of the speakers have raised it. This is, in my view, what the big development challenge is throughout the world. And I myself get exposed to this in my own travels. From 1981 to 1986, my full-time job was here in the Latin America program of the Woodrow Wilson Center. I was a Latin America specialist. And from 1986 to 2011, I was Dean of the School of International Service at American University. I had to negotiate partnerships with schools and colleges and research institutes all around the world because my faculty and students needed to go there. So for the last 20 years, I've been traveling all over the world, but mostly to Asia. And as Dr. Moreno said, not just to China, but the country I've spent the most time in this year has been Azerbaijan. Not a country that you think of too much, but a country for which there's tremendous trade possibilities for Latin American countries. It's the 20th largest producer of oil and gas in the world. And when you look at the curricula vitae of the speakers that we have here, especially the two that are seated here, they've traveled all over the world and had experiences in universities throughout the world to learn their perspectives. One thing I know, for those of you that are young, and I see a lot of young people here, if you want to get advanced degrees, why not get them in Asia? Every Asian university that I go to wants more American students. And that's a great way to learn. And for those of you that are older, every Asian university that I go to wants American faculty, and they pay good salaries. So I'm not their agent. You know, I'll leave it to individuals to do it on their own. These are very important things to do. Now, I also want to say that you can even start here. You know, for years when I was here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, I read this journal religiously all the time. Now I read this journal religiously all the time, Global Asia. It's almost as inexpensive as the CEPAL Review. And there are wonderful books to read. If you want to read a book about North America, read Bob Pastor's The North American Idea. If you want to read a book about Southeast Asia and ASEAN and how it's developing, Amitabh Acharya's books on the formation of ASEAN are things to learn about, to get the kind of competence that those of us that focus on Latin America need to have to be able to think about the next development challenges. Now, I said that the big challenge is avoiding the middle income trap. And probably most people in this room know what it is, but probably some don't and are too timid to say that. The middle income trap is, in the words of the Asian Development Bank, how to be like South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, and not to be like South Africa or Brazil. Those are the negative cases. They say countries caught in the middle income trap are unable to compete with low income, low wage economies in manufactured exports and are similarly unable to compete with advanced economies in high skill areas. The result is the pattern of bursts like we've seen in Latin America, followed by stagnation or decline. And while, as Richard points out convincingly, it's not going to be like it was in the past, there still can be little blips, and if you look at the data, the little blips are there much more for Brazil and South Africa than there are for Singapore, Taiwan, and South Korea. And so not being able to compete with the low and with the high innovation is the middle income trap. Now, trade diversification, which is one of the things we've talked about, is a very important element in getting out of the middle income trap. But having a big vision and pushing for that big vision is the way Asian countries talk about it. No Asian leader would have been talking about their cases the way we're talking about them now. You can read in last Sunday's Washington Post, there was a story about President Park of Korea's vision for South Korea, which is to create a Silicon Valley that eclipses Silicon Valley in California. And pushing that vision, and that is in a country that has a low birth rate and an aging population. It's not a country that has a gravy train to ride on. Yet that's the vision that she's had and that she's pushing it. The Asian Development Bank lists things that need to be done to get out of the middle income trap. And they say, promoting equity and inclusion throughout the population. You need as many people to be involved in your national project as possible. And if people can't read and if people are poor, they cannot be productive for you within your national project. Developing human capital. And in Latin America, we know that's now at the tertiary level that's needed to do to be able to compete in these innovation areas. Fostering technology, development, and innovation. Beginning to push so that you can compete not just in commodities and manufacturing, but also in the knowledge economy. When I'm in Asia, that's where people are talking about creating new jobs and creating new value in the knowledge economy. Advancing regional cooperation and trade. You need a solid base in your region or else you're hamstrung fighting with your neighbors. And improve governance, institutions, and implementation. And as Richard pointed out in his paper, it's come a long way, but it has a long way to go. And this requires political leadership to sustain the ambition to grow fast, to take a pragmatic, non-ideological, results-driven view, to take a long-term, multi-generational view, to engage in sustained institutional building for this objective, and to manage restructuring when some elements lose their competitive advantage. So my question is, not only is Latin America reaching across the Pacific to engage in trade, but is Latin America reaching across the Pacific to embrace the development project which has moved some Asian countries out of the middle income trap and for which leaders in every single Asian country that I've visited are obsessed with moving about. Now, we have looked at the trade element. Among the 6 elements I mentioned, regional trade and cooperation was one that was very important. We've talked a lot about trade. We talked a little bit about regional cooperation. How does regional cooperation happen? International relations scholars and practitioners tell us that regional cooperation happens when countries that have resources develop public goods that are available to all the countries in a region, and the smaller countries have access to those public goods and they develop a natural affinity. When I look at ASEAN, Indonesia is doing this big time. When I look at SAARC, the South Asian Regional Cooperation, India is doing this big time. When I look at West Asia, Turkey is doing this big time. If you read Bob Pastor's The North American Idea, you'll be very disappointed in the United States. You've heard the discussions about South America here. It's not really happening in the United States. So there are things that need to do to be ambitious the way Asia has been ambitious. We can't, I would hope we're not just satisfied with moving along with the trends that they've moved along. And this project, reaching across the Pacific, reaching across for trade, but reaching across for development projects, and especially figuring out how to operate as regions is very, very important. Now, we are fortunate to have terrific speakers here today for this panel. And Adriana Abdinur is going to be the first person to speak. And she is at the Pontifical Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro. She's head of the BRICS Policy Center. Her topic is Brazil's trade with Asia, key drivers and challenges ahead. And she's a person who has focused on Asian studies since her undergraduate studies at Harvard, her graduate studies at Princeton, and has had experience working and teaching in many areas of Asia. Adriana, could you lead off, and you will have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, and also thank you to the organizers, especially Cynthia and Jorge, for this invitation, for this great project. I arrived yesterday in DC from Rio de Janeiro. My heart's still back home, not only because of my baby, but also because my students were so deeply engaged in the protests that have been occurring since Monday, basically. And they had me on speaker so that I could accompany their experiences during the protests. And yesterday I was very exhausted, but I had enough energy to do the one thing that I always make sure to do in DC, which is to eat good Ethiopian food. So I headed over to Das, and I was reading excerpts from Jeremy Edelman's new biography of Alberto Hirschman, where I can't wait to read the entire volume. But I just happened to read about Hirschman had a specific conception of risk, and he thought that sometimes you engage in infrastructure projects and you just throw yourself into it, and depending on the circumstance, it's a great learning experience. And I thought back to my students, because when I asked them, why are you protesting? What do you want? And they said, we don't know, but we have to have change. So maybe Hirschman would have a little bit to say, but I think this is indicative in the broader sense that Brazil really is at a crossroads. Now, not just in the specific experience of these students, whose experience, by the way, has everything to do with trade with Asia, because many of them are part of this the new middle class, which in the case of Brazil, it's the first generation that has grown up being able to take for granted democracy. My undergraduate students were born around 1990, so it's a big generational difference. So I think I'd like to speak to this crossroads concept in terms of trade, but more generally in terms of Brazilian foreign policy and trade strategy, which of course ties back to this story of where are we right now. And I'm going to take the liberty of abandoning my PowerPoint, because I think it would be quite redundant. We've already heard a lot of the story, so I'm going to gloss over the general patterns. And what I'd like to speak is more specifically about Brazil's political choices domestically and abroad. And they involve, of course, not just Asia, but multilateralism in several different contexts, which present new challenges, perhaps new opportunities, if Brazil can only make up its mind. So Brazil has two reputations, right, in terms of trade. On the one hand, it is a commodities powerhouse. Richard Feinberg mentioned that this is not a monocultural sector. We have quite a diversified commodities production sector. It's also very advanced, technologically sophisticated, export-oriented sector. But it's important to remember that despite this status as a powerhouse and the explosive growth of Brazilian exports, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years, Brazil still has a very closed economy. There was a recent study done of the G20 countries, and Brazil comes in dead last in that one in almost every study. It's more closed economy than that of India by many respects. So it's important to keep in mind, you know, the relative importance of trade, right, in an analytical sense and maybe even a normative sense. Should Brazil be more concerned with trade? And I think here the political discourse that we see emerging, especially these last few months, say that yes, even voices from industry are starting to clamor for a deeper engagement with a bilateral trade specifically. So, okay, so Brazil is a commodities powerhouse. It's a closed economy. It's already benefited a great deal from this boom in Brazil trade, Asia trade, which of course goes beyond the China factor. Really, it still includes Japan, which is a historical partner, but also South Korea has emerged even beyond Japan as a trade partner. And at home, the gains that Brazil has made over the last 10 years are very closely connected, because this boom has added to the economic dynamism, which, coupled with redistributive policies and certain innovative public policies, has contributed to the growth, for instance, of this large middle class and poverty alleviation schemes really throughout the country. Gonzalo was speaking of the almost psychological experience of Argentines, right? In this experience of decline, and then a government that comes in with new ideas, whether we like them or not. There is a very specific psychological aspect, I think, to the Brazilian experience. I'm not romanticizing it, because I'm very critical of certain aspects, but it's the feeling that Brazil arrived, you know, at least in some respects, right? And this has its reflection not only in the feeling that, okay, we're doing some things right, finally, you know, finally is the key word, but in terms of its foreign policy, especially with the Workers' Party administration, starting with Lula, we see a foreign policy that becomes, I guess, more assertive, more activist, very ambitious in some respects, perhaps I think excessively so in some of the more exotic adventures, but it tries to project Brazil not just within its immediate vicinity, but outside the Latin American region. And this is key to understanding, because Brazil's diversification strategy is not explained only by supply and demand of commodities. It is part and parcel of a broader strategy of geopolitical insertion that really takes even the concept of South-South cooperation and makes that into an ideological banner in certain circumstances, okay? Even as, in practice, Brazil's ties to the so-called North, I don't like this dichotomy, but you know, it's been widely adopted. Even if in practice, northern partners are still very important to Brazilian trade and other areas. So understanding that certain circles within Brazilian government and allied groups outside Brazilian government have this project of global projection. In practice, it means, for instance, the bid for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. It means increasing its influence within the South Atlantic. Brazil is building a fleet of nuclear propulsion submarines. This is not coincidental. This is part of this rather ambitious strategy of projection and seizing upon the concept of South-South cooperation as a way to do this. Now, depending on who you speak to, it's a complement or a substitute. For the more ideological, the more radical position, it is a substitute in the long term for relations with the North, and particularly a Northern-dominated global governance system, which Brazil, and here it's across the board, you'll find very few detractors, tries to accelerate in its transformation. And this helps to explain Brazil's participation not only in the established multilateral regimes, and here, by the way, in trade, as we all know, Brazil bet very heavily in the World Trade Organization and in the Doha round, which puts it in some hot water at this point. I'll come back to this point. But in addition to becoming very activist and acquiring very sophisticated diplomatic experience, I think, within the multilateral, the Bretton Woods and UN organizations, it begins to participate more actively, and in this, it is set apart from its neighbors in these informal coalitions, of which BRICS is just one. There's G20, there's IBSA, there are others. They're trans-regional, interlocking, mini-lateral arrangements that feed into one another in ways that we don't quite understand. We're trying to map out some of these connections. So Brazil's project of beyond regional insertion is related directly to its trade with Asia, because Asia offers not only a way to boost its exports, if we can figure it out, perhaps also diversify our own exports. That's been problematic. I'll speak to that briefly. But also it offers political partnerships, including within the established, the UN regimes. And it's no coincidence that Brazil has also increased its relation with Africa massively. I mean, Brazil's cooperation with Africa has grown explosively beyond, by the way, the figures that are provided by the government, because they have a very different definition of development cooperation, for instance, than is used by the OECD. So Brazil trade with Asia, right, beyond the China factor, has to be understood within this broader calculus. I mean, maybe calculus is a little bit too coherent, but these different opportunities that are arising for Brazil to be a major player in some respects at a global level. Now, this the trade with Asia, as has already been mentioned here, it poses also new asymmetries. Now, when I say that Brazil bet very heavily in the World Trade Organization, right? And I think the rejection of the free trade agreement of the Americas was part of this. A lot of the discourse at the time was that Brazil would be, many of our sectors would be endangered by the presence specifically of the US within this arrangement. One of the big ironies is that Brazil is now beginning to face the same issues with respect to Asia, and specifically with respect to China. A lot of people don't like to talk about this at all, but it comes out in the anonymous conversations I had during the writing of this paper. And so, of course, part of these asymmetries have to do with the composition of the trade between Brazil and the fact that it's still kind of addicted to its commodities despite a diversification of that basket. But also China represents, and Asia broadly, they represent growing competition in third markets. Not just Mexico, US, Europe, but also we see this in our fieldwork in Africa. You see direct competition of Brazilian manufactured goods that are going to Africa with their Chinese counterparts and the Japanese and Korean as well. Another dilemma that's related to these new asymmetries is really, I think, more recent perhaps. You always start thinking when you reach a semi-crisis stage, growth has slowed down. Okay, in Brazil, this was very clear in 2012. We went from 7.5 GDP growth per year to under 1%. That's quite a significant drop. The projections for this year are not very optimistic. They're starting to think of maybe growth for next year. And of course, on the Asian side, we also see revision of growth figures. So this comes at a time when the Brazilian model, the Brazilian development model, as it's been implemented over the last few years, starts to reach a stretching point. And I think that's what the protests have to do. Something has got to give. We cannot maintain such low levels of unemployment, our interest rates as they have been, without something giving. And I think the inflation rates that we begin to see are part of this story. Now, how do you take up growth again without boosting trade? I don't have a good answer to that. And I think that there are more groups now realizing that in order to have a sustained growth that doesn't gnaw away at our social gains over the last 10 years, we're going to have to increase our trade. And here we face a series of strategic decisions, not only bilaterally, but multilaterally, because obviously Brazil is a significant player within the World Trade Organization. It's one of the most, probably the most activist country. Roberto Azevedo, who was elected, is a very, very competent diplomat, very experienced within that area. But he's no longer acting on behalf of Brazil. Obviously, there's more than symbolic weight, I think, to him being there. If there wasn't, then we would have seen diversification of the head of the WTO before now, and less controversy about the nationality. But he will be working for the system, not for Brazil. I think this is a very important point. And then Brazil finds itself, right, in this growing conundrum because, on the one hand, within South America, it belongs to Mercosur, and Mercosur is very weakened. I mean, Argentina is not interested in liberalization in the same ways that Brazil is interested. You have the Aliança Pacífica rising, and that excludes Brazil, certainly for now. Brazil's not even on the Pacific, right? So we also have to keep in mind that there are geographic and infrastructural constraints to what it can do with Asia. Now, of course, the other big part of the puzzle, which I don't think has been mentioned very much here, but this is the big concern right now. The US and Europe trade talks, okay? If that goes ahead, and it seems to me like there's a good chance that something will happen, this will put Brazil in a very difficult situation, even more than it is now, I think, because Brazil has to forge some alliances, bilaterally and multilaterally. And what's happening now, in my understanding, is that Brazil is leaving itself out of these regional and trans-regional arrangements that are arising. So what to do about it? I mean, I do think that boosting and changing leverage in negotiations with Asian trade would be wonderful. Through Mercosur would be ideal, but I am not very optimistic about the political concert among the units at the moment. It's great to hear from some of the colleagues that Aliança Pacífica might be open to some conversation at some point, because I think that pooling of resources and leverage is necessary to redress some of the problems. Of course, the main challenge is to do our homework at home and to really address the structural problems which they're literally at the bursting seams, right? We have our education system. All the measures that are being taken in this respect are stopgap measures. Infrastructure, the government just announced a major package for ports. But when you look at what actually came out of the legislation, it's been watered down through pressure by interest groups. including those that have vested interest in maintaining our ports and transport infrastructure the way they have been, fossilized for decades now. And so Brazil really, I think, is at a crossroads. It's not just a cliche, not just in terms of its domestic policy making, but articulating that with a more coherent trade strategy, which is not just related to Asia. It really is about where are we going to turn to, because we cannot rely only on ourselves. I think even the radicals have realized that.
I granted 2 more minutes.
Okay, great. I'll cut short my conclusion, but a couple of considerations. First, there's a really big debate that is not restrained to Brazil. The think tank that I coordinate is called the BRICS Policy Center. We're not a government mouthpiece, and we're not just focused on the BRICS, but we've been observing, especially over the last 2 years, this new debate about the developmental state and whether state-centered development, it really is the new wave. There have been conferences, including in Rio, called, the Beijing Consensus. Is that the new model to be followed? Which is, I think, a very simplistic take. But there is, at an ideological level, conversation about whether the model for development and integration into value chains should be inspired more on an Asian model. And this is not specific to Brazil. We see even South Africa. I was just in South Africa, and this conversation is taking place. Obviously, this grossly underestimates the extent to which these models are different. The way that the state in Brazil acts is completely different from the way that it acts in India. I mean, just take the agricultural sector and trade, for instance, right? Brazil and India, they have diametrically opposed positions in terms of trade in agriculture. So there are also, by the way, constraints on how much Brazil can follow through with this South-South cooperation in its more extreme version. But I think that this is almost an identity debate, because there are groups in Brazil that foster an anti-North rhetoric that look ideologically sort of sideways for solutions. When I think there are, institutional constraints in place and political constraints, and the fact that we're having these protests, to me, it's a very healthy reminder of our democracy, our identity as a democracy. These are the biggest protests. I don't know what they're for. They're not about the bus fare. But the last time, no, they're not. It's not just the 20 cents. It's obvious. But, it's the last time we had this was 20 years ago. I was a teenager and I participated. It was the impeachment of Fernando Collor. So to see my students, having this inside them is very healthy. I'm very excited. I don't know what they want either, but I hope they figure it out soon. And I think that part of what they have to figure out is pushing the government, not just to implement this policy domestically, but to figure out Brazil's position in the world in terms of foreign policy, but also in terms of its trade policy. One final note. We always have to end on the pressão. It's inevitable. Brazil has vast reserves of petroleum and gas within the pre-salt layers. It also has the technology to prospect and explore this petroleum, within the short to midterm. This is going to change the picture, and it might not be the prettiest picture, as we have learned from history. All of these strategic choices that Brazilian society and Brazilian government are making, they have to take into account, right, these factors that are coming up in the horizon, whether it's the US-Europe agreement, whether it's the Aliança Pacífica signing free trade agreements with Asia, but also the fact that we have this large reserve of petroleum. This is going to alter the structure of our economy more than any trade has so far. So I think that I hope that Brazil keeps in mind that these are all interrelated priorities that have to be addressed in order to figure out even just one small but significant piece of the puzzle, which is our trade with Asia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are such important questions and challenges, and important not only for Brazil but for the whole region. And now we'll turn to Mauricio, whose education was in 2 great universities in the Western Hemisphere, Los Andes in Bogota and SAIS here in Washington, D.C. And Mauricio heads FEDESarrollo, which has been for decades one of the premier institutions focusing on analyzing development not only in Colombia but in Latin America overall. And before that, he was Vice Minister for External Commerce. So he's been central to these issues, both as a practitioner and as a scholar. Mauricio, you have 15 minutes. Adelante.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you understand me? Hopefully. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks Cindy and Jorge and the Wilson Center for this invitation. I really regret not being there. I am here with Sandra Oviedo, the co-author of the paper. I really regret not being there, but we faced yesterday a restriction on trade on services. Particularly, it was difficult to purchase an air ticket, believe it or not. Since we have some difficulties, because this long distance format, I will try to focus on three main ideas. I hope that you can show the slides that I will mention. If you can't, it doesn't matter. We can forget about the PowerPoint, but we'll see if you can see those slides. The main argument that I'm going to make is the following. Colombia is a very closed economy. As was the case of Brazil, Colombia is not as open to the world trade as some of our neighbors, and we are not as open to the trade with Asia or to the investment with Asia as some of our neighbors. There is a difference, however, in the case of Colombia, if you compare it to the case of Brazil. Brazil is 6 times, the Brazilian economy is 6 times the Colombian economy. That means that the Brazilians can deal with the domestic market and that they can develop some economies of scale and competitive advantages relying on the domestic market. Colombia cannot make that. So we have to look to the rest of the world. We have to strengthen our links with the world economy, and we have to strengthen our links with the Asian economy. Here you see the first. This illustration, this slide, shows perfectly how behind we are in terms of trade. You can see that we are in a very low position in Latin America. This is exports plus imports as a percentage of GDP. However, we cannot stay there. We have to go to the international economy, and please go ahead with the following. We can go to the slide number 8, if you can go there, please. Because what I want to show you, ahead there, is that in terms of our trade with Asia, we are also behind a lot of our neighbors. We are in a very early stage of our relationship with Asia, both in trade terms. Here you can see exports per capita to Asia, the Latin American countries. Please go 2 slides ahead, and that is imports per capita. That shows that we are in a relatively bad position in both terms. Then, in terms of investment, if you can go ahead 3 slides, thank you very much. The participation of Asia in the foreign direct investment to Colombia is very, very, very small. The discussions that we heard about the case of Peru are very alien to us. We are not dealing with those issues and with those discussions in the case of Colombia. And this is something important that I want to highlight before abandoning the first argument of the 3 that I want to make. Colombia is behind in its internationalization process, is behind in the relationship with Asia, but it is very intriguing that Colombia today is the 3rd or the 4th economy in Latin America. We have been growing above the average of Latin America. We have, depending on how you measure our GDP, we may be today the 3rd economy behind Brazil and Mexico in Latin America, and yet it is worth highlighting that Colombia is behind in the relationship with Asia and with the rest of the world. The second argument that I want to make, even though we are behind, we are facing some of the problems that we have been dealing with in the panel, in the seminar today. We have been going our industry is losing participation in the GDP. Our exports to the world are going to the primary sector, basically. We are losing strength in the industrial sector. And Asia is playing a role, not the main role, that's what I want to highlight, but is playing a role. So if you please can show the slide 18, which is 6 slides from now, ahead, please. Here you see the evolution of the composition of exports in the Colombian case. And what I want to convey to you is the importance that the mining sector has been acquiring in the last 5 years or so, and how the industrial sector, which was the most important sector in the exports of Colombia for a long time, is losing its position vis-a-vis the mining sector. This is what we want to prevent, at least some of us, in the relationship with Asia, this kind of development of the pattern of trade. Here comes the question: what is the role of Asia in this development? And I want to ask you please to go 2 slides ahead so that I can show you. Here is the participation of Asia in the exports of Colombia. And you see that the most important development has to do with the mining sector. Since 2007 and up to the present, you can see the gray line going up and up and up with some changes in the middle, but definitely the most important pattern of our recent trade has to do with the increasing importance of Asia as a destiny of the mining sector. This is also what we want to prevent, at least some of us, in our relationship with Asia. Please go to the next slide, and we will see what happens with imports. This is the participation of Asia in the Colombian imports. And what I want to highlight is that the industrial sector is playing the central role, maybe with some strengthening in the last 4 years, but in terms of imports, the change has not been as dramatic as in the case of exports. What is interesting here is that in Colombia, within Colombia, we have been having a discussion about what is happening. The industry, when I was listening to the seminar a few minutes ago, we received the data for the GDP growth of the first quarter of this year. The industry is falling. The industry fell 4% in the first quarter, and in the last 2 years or so, the industry is very weak. The public debate has to do with what to do with industry, and not as a main topic of discussion, but in any case, it's present, what to do with Asia. So what I want to show you, if you can go ahead, 2 slides, please, that this is the participation of manufacturing, of industry in the GDP of different countries in Latin America. What I want to show you is that the situation of Colombia, which is in the top right of the slide, is not exceptional. In all of our countries, the manufacturing sector has been losing terrain. If you take into account that each bar refers to a single decade, this is a process which has taken a long time, at least the 2 last decades, the last of the last century and the first of this century. We have been losing in several Latin American countries a participation of the manufacturing sector. To what extent has that to do with Asia in the Colombian case? Not much. Not much, because we are not very open to the world trade. We are not very open to the trade with Asia. However, Asia is playing a role. I want to put another hypothesis. I think that in Latin America, but in particular in Colombia, the manufacturing sector has been suffering because we have not been able to deal with 2 things. The first one, if you can go back a slide, please. The first one, this is the exchange rate of the Colombian peso with the US dollar. This is not exceptional in Latin America. This shows that many of our countries have been facing an appreciation of our currencies. That may change in this year and the following years, depending on the US monetary policy. But in any case, this shows a loss of competitiveness of our productive sectors, which is behind the crisis, quote unquote, of the manufacturing sector and all tradable sectors in some of our countries, in particular in Colombia. But beyond that, and that leads me to the last argument that I want to convey to you. Please go ahead 2 slides and stop there, please. Beyond that, the problem and the way that we have to deal with this relationship with Asia has to do with increasing competitiveness. I think that we are, in Colombia at least, much more concerned discussing if the FTA with the US is going to kill the Colombian productive sector, or if we can deal with the Koreans or the Japanese or the Chinese. And we should focus much more on the competitiveness of the Colombian sector. I want to show you 2 or 3 slides to make this argument. Please go to the next slide. These are the FTAs signed by different countries in Latin America. Colombia is in the left side. As you may see, we are behind some of our neighbors. Please go 2 slides ahead. We are trying to catch up. We have signed already an FTA with South Korea. We are currently negotiating an FTA with Japan. South Korea and Japan already have FTAs with Peru, with Chile. And we are starting to explore the possibility to negotiate with China. We are trying to catch up in terms of the trade with Asia. Please go to the next slide. We have already, some of you have already talked about the Pacific Alliance. For me, this is the most important bet that Colombia and some of the countries in Latin America can make in order not only to trade with Asia, but also to insert our economies in global value chains in an intelligent way, with a strategic sense. It's difficult for Latin American countries to talk about the strategies. We are always thinking in the short term, but this is the most important bet that we can make. And in the Colombian case, and these are my 2 final slides, we have to work, please go to the following. We have to work very, very hard in human capital. Luis was saying a few minutes ago that in order for the Asian countries to avoid the middle income trap, they have worked hardly, they have worked in a very hard way to improve the human capital. Here is the situation of Colombia. These are the PISA tests of the OECD, and Colombia is doing very, very badly in mathematics, science, and reading. Instead of getting huge concerns about the Koreans and the Japanese, we have to work in Colombia at least very, very hard in dealing with this situation. And please go to the following and the last slide. This is the infrastructure. For some of you that already know Colombia, the upper part of the country is the Caribbean coast, and the part in the left of the map is the Pacific coast. We are in this graph, we can see that we have developed much more our links with the US and the Caribbean and the Atlantic Ocean, and we have worked very few in increasing our links with the Pacific Ocean and, of course, with Asia. So, in the case of Colombia, we are behind some of our neighbors in this relationship with Asia. We are in an early stage, and we have an opportunity to have a strategic, intelligent way of inserting with Asia. And that strategic way of inserting with Asia has to do with infrastructure, as you may see, and has to do with human capital. Unless we improve competitiveness, the rest of the discussion is pure gas, and that's my argumentation.
Mauricio, thank you very much. You were so clear and well organized. We still feel that you're sitting right here at the table, and congratulations to you and also to Sandra on an excellent paper. Stand by for the questions.
Thank you.
The final presenter in this panel is Enrique Dussel, and he is a political economist. He's a professor at UNAM in Mexico City. He runs the China Center in Mexico City. His education has embraced both the sacred and the profane, having a degree from the Free University in Berlin and also from Notre Dame. So I'll turn the floor over to Enrique.
Okay, good afternoon again. Thank you very much for the invitation. Look, I'm the last, so is there anything new to say? No, I will try to be very brief with the long PowerPoint I had. No, one first topic. No, I think it would be relevant and to be a little bit provocative, I would say, to take much more seriously the discussion in development economics regarding global commodity chains. Many people here have spoken of supply chains and Hirschman and many other topics, no? And I would say this discussion is very significant because it allows to discuss us and go beyond commodities. From the morning, from the first talk to the last one, we've heard several times apparently there is a problem. We are exporting commodities, mineral goods, soya, etc., and Asia is exporting to Latin America manufactured goods. I would say, yes, correct. By the way, we know this 10 years ago. No? Two, it's not a discussion, and here there is a theoretical and conceptual discussion that I would invite you to go through from Gary Gerefi, Bear. We have participated in this discussion on systemic competitiveness, etc. It's not a matter, if you put it very extremely, things are not like that, but it doesn't matter if you produce strawberries or satellites. No, it's the same. What is relevant are the processes. No? So if you say it's problematic that China is investing in minerals and this is causing us headaches, no? Why? Because we would love to the China invests in manufacturing. Well, I tell you, a good case is Mexico. No? China and Asia is investing in manufacturing. If that is what you're looking for, we have that. No? So again, from Raúl Prebisch, with global commodity chains, etc., I would invite you to go through the issue of products. Things are not like that, but I would say provocatively, products are irrelevant. Relevant are processes, no? Which means you are investing in minerals, well, no problem. You are investing in the agricultural sector in Brazil, Argentina. The problem is not soya beans. The problem is that you are not doing the processes that Monsanto is doing. Of course, in agricultural sector and minerals, you can achieve upgrade in terms of the discussion. You can have high segments of value-added chains in R&D, in value-added, in wages, etc. So again, this would redirect the discussion of the problems are commodities. I would say I do not agree. By the way, a long discussion with Raúl Prebisch, which I think was not correct on the discussion. Today we can discuss this at the 10-digit level of the harmonized tariff system with 17,000 products, no? On A, no? B, I would say, is Latin America and China, and based on the first topic, competing with China, no? And with Asia? I would say we're very ignorant on this topic. We do not understand regarding Asia, and in particularly regarding China, the China is very different than anything else we have faced in the last hundreds of years. If you go through the property issue, no, we've been in the last 2-3 years discussing, I invite you to go through some of these issues in our webpage. If you go through China's overseas foreign direct investment, for example, no, we published an interesting issue there with Kevin Gallagher and others. No, 87% of China's overseas foreign direct investment in Latin America is by the public sector. No, this is absolutely different than in any other part of the world. I say politely, but not a provocation, This means that the CIA is buying minerals in Mexico. No, what would that mean? Or in Peru, or in Argentina, or whatever. 87%. Public sector is, by the way, much more than state-owned. No, it's the municipal level, at the city level, at the provincial level, and yes, at the central government level. This has huge implications. This is not profit maximizing. This has implications, political, ecological, law, and other implications. No, so again, if we do not understand what we are dealing with, I'm not bashing anyone. I'm just saying understand what you are enhancing. No, yes, we want to have Asia's and Chinese FDI. If we do not have a clue of what we're speaking of, we are going to have huge problems. No, and finally, I would say, and this is based on the presentation, I would say that at least based on the Mexican case, and I would say this is not so different in most of other Latin American countries, we have had at least, I would say, a lost decade in terms of institutional development in Latin America, and particularly in Mexico. In the paper, I tried to do a very brief and descriptive analysis of how weak Mexican institutions, the public sector, I enumerate some of them, particularly the private sector, very weak in understanding Asia, not to speak of Indonesia, no? or any of the 20 Asian countries that we agreed to discuss. No? So a lost decade, I would say, in terms of institutional framework, which is critical. We've talked a lot about the issue of competitiveness. Well, there is more than 20 years of a discussion of systemic competitiveness, and the meso level and institutional analysis and level of competitiveness is critical. So why is there a lack of strategy, of a vision, of a dream, you would say, regarding Asia? It is also because of this. Finally, I would say the need to understand much more in detail regarding products, processes, Asia, and particular countries. No? Again, we have been, and I was told not to talk too much about China. It's a little bit difficult sometimes, but just to understand the complexity of trade investment relationships. No? We've talked. The Mexican case is very good for that. We have a problem with Asia, also with China. No, in China, Mexico has a 10-to-1 export-import trade relationship. We're exporting 1, importing 10. That we know. In the paper you will find lots of statistics, no, of yo-yo economics, things going up and down and down and up, and at the end you understand very little. But in the case of China, we have not done the same, and it would be important to do, and I would invite to do the same to our colleagues. In the case of China for Mexico, 91% of Mexican imports coming from China are capital goods and intermediate goods. No? So this goes much beyond saying, well, importing is bad, exporting is good, and if we have a trade deficit, very bad. That's not sufficient, to put it politely. No? Again, 91% of total imports coming from China. So to say we want to reduce imports from China or we want to increase exports, it's a highly complex issue that I would say, finally, that we have to do a lot more of research. We simply do not know. We have not done it. In the academic sector, we're working with this, with a new created Latin American network regarding concrete processes for mining, for the oil sector, for manufacturing, etc. And what are the differences, of course, also with other European processes, goods, etc. No? So now I will simply almost finish. I would say Mexico, contrary to what was said in the morning, Mexico has very good linkages to the MIT, to Harvard, etc., to all these guys, from Pedro Aspe to Luis Videgaray, etc. Of course, absolutely ignorant on Asia. No? So even if you study in Harvard, this does not mean that you know very well about other parts of the world. No? Again, you have public institutions, strategies, etc., regarding Mexico, also regarding academic institutions. I will skip all this and simply go to this one, which is, and then go to the conclusions. No, so again, this is, I would say, a proxy of what is going on in Mexico and what has been discussing. The problem are commodities. We want to go out of commodities. I would say we are not understanding what is going on. The problem are not minerals, but the problem is the processes you are doing with minerals or soya beans, etc. So imagine Mexico, this is trade by technology content. Mexico is very, I would say, relatively successful in terms of its technology content of medium and high technologies. No? So today, total exports of Mexico account for almost 60% of products with medium and high technology content. This is highly related to US trade, a high level of intra-industrial trade, and NAFTA. No, we've worked on this with a lot of detail. Look at the difference with Asia. No, so Asia only accounts for less than 20% of Mexican exports, trade, growing very fast, but more than 70% of Asian imports are with a high level of technology, in contrast to Mexican exports. No? So we have a huge gap regarding the technology content. I don't care, again, I put it very extreme, if it is minerals, copper, or if it is satellites. No? I'm going now to the conclusions, lots of other things, and so I would say, again, in terms of the liberalization strategy in Mexico, you will find a lot of quotations, etc. Asia was not an important case, with the exception of Japan, and this is also, I would say, as a result of a personal belief and interest of President Salinas de Gortari, who had a clear vision that Japan was important. The institutional framework is very important. I mentioned here how within the ministries regarding Secretaría de Economía, Relaciones Exteriores, etc., we have a Subsecretaría para América del Norte, but we have nothing on Asia, nothing on China, etc., etc. And finally, what are some of the proposals? I would say we have to invest in these institutions. If we do not invest institutions, public, private, which are extremely weak, and academic institutions. Within China, within Asia, China and Japan are by far the most relevant regarding trade. China is not investing in Mexico until today. I would be very skeptical. I know there are a lot of good and interesting works and favorable views of TPP and the Pacific Alliance. I would say strictly in terms of FDI and trade, which was what we were invited to, this is very irrelevant for Mexico. No? I mean, who are the important guys in the TPP? The United States, Japan, and Canada. In terms of trade and investment, Mexico has a free trade agreement with the three. If you want something with Australia, which is fine, go bilaterally. You don't have to do something else. No, so and with this I finish. I would say, from a Mexican perspective, the most relevant in terms of Asia is NAFTA. If you want to discuss with Asia, you have to discuss the issue within NAFTA. And what is very surprising, we've been discussing this with Ariel and other colleagues, is that where are all the Sidney Weintraubs and Salinas de Gortaris and all these guys in favor of NAFTA 20 years ago? We don't find them. No? We should be now celebrating 20 years of NAFTA, and we have reached important results, some of them very critical, and nobody talks about NAFTA, neither in Mexico nor in the United States. This is very surprising. So again, yes, there might be a rosy picture, I would say, regarding Asia and Mexico, possibly. Very rosy now with the visit of Xi Jinping to Mexico. Important qualitative steps, but be careful. No? We have been, promised now that Mexico and China will be integral strategic partners. Great. But we have been strategic partners for 10 years and reached the worst relationship in the last 10 years. No? They say we are going to be able to export pork meat. Again, we have 17,000 products. This has been promised for 5 years. No? We are being promised that we will be able to export tequila. This was promised 3 years ago. No? So I would say yes, maybe, never say never, but hasta no ver, no querer. No? Thank you very much.
So Enrique, thank you so much. In terms of the process, you mastered both the presentation and the time limit perfectly. So thank you. Do we have questions from the audience? This gentleman here in the middle, if you could begin. We'll take 2 or 3, and then we'll have.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Valentin, and I work for a Japanese consulting firm, Washington Core.
Who do you work for?
Washington Core, it's a
Okay.
Japanese research
Yeah.
firm. And I thought it was very interesting when you mentioned that the goal of Latin American countries would be to avoid the middle income trap, following Korea's example, which was Korea achieved success through technological development. So I was wondering, I haven't heard much about the technology issue, technology transfers, interest from, by Asian governments or companies in investing in the technology sector in Latin America, or building the technological capability so that we can, that that is somehow beneficial for both parties, or at least for Latin America. So I was wondering if you could say something about that.
Great. Next question, this woman here.
Hi, my name is Isabella Thabens, and I am from the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. So I have a question for Enrique Dussel, in that as the infrastructure in Mexico needs reform and improvement, what are the prospects for workers in companies near the border, in workers all around Mexico, but specifically those that engage in trade with the U.S. and export their products to the U.S.?
Great. And Carlos, the third. I'm sorry. Marcos.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Adriana. It's about the Brazilian global trade policy. If there is some Brazilian positioning regarding the debate on WTO future and WTO 2.0 and TPP. You mentioned the transatlantic negotiation, but you said a little about the TPP, which has almost equal impact in global trade. So I would like very much if you can add something.
We'll try to. Cindy, you had a question?
Yeah, just one last question for Mauricio. Mauricio, you mentioned how far behind Colombia is in terms of its relationship with Asia. And my question is whether within, say, the political or economic elite, or even in universities and think tanks, whether this is a significant issue that people think about. For a long time, the focus of the country has been on the security strategy. Now there's a peace process. Concluding the FTA with the U.S. was also, a central foreign policy concern. The Pacific Alliance is a major focus. To what extent is there an understanding of the need to deepen and diversify the relationship with Asia?
Okay, we'll answer the questions in order. Valentin, you asked me about this technology development. And I'll give you an example from Mexico. There's a company in Mexico, the largest fertilizer company, called Fertinal. Fertinal goes and mines sulfates in Baja California, puts them on ships, and sends them in bulk to different places. Fertinal has barely developed the technology for packaging and marketing their product. Fertinal has not looked at those sulfates and thought about and done research on how those sulfates could be used in innovative ways to promote crop growth and other benefits throughout the world. They haven't done research to figure out how it could be used in non-agricultural ways. The kind of process that Enrique was talking about, which is absolutely critical, can involve technology transfer from Asia, but more important for Latin America, has to develop research and development capacity in Latin American places. If you compare Fertinal with Cargill, for example, in Minnesota, the research capacity, the insertion in the value chain is very, very different. And I think that's a very good example and something that we could go country by country to look at. I think the next question was directed at you, Adriana, if I'm correct.
There's a question about Mexico, Isabel's question. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, right,
Yeah.
okay. Sorry.
Look, very briefly, so how is employment and wages going to be affected, no, in the border? I would be much more cautious and critical than there is I would say it is fashionable to say now that wages in Asia and China are going up. There is somehow a miraculous mechanism and automatism that this will somehow benefit Mexico, no? And I would say this is empirically wrong, no? The New York Times, the Washington Post, and several have been publishing this in terms again of wages going up, FDI in Mexico also going up. This is not correct. Empirically, I would say show me 5 cases where this has happened in the last 6 months, no? Of course, it would be beautiful, no, if it would be happen so fast, no. I would say again, and we have been working in detail. If you go to the webpage in detail on the auto parts automobile chain, in the electronics chain, in the yarn textile garment chain. Why? This relates again to a conceptual vision. What does this mean? From a discussion regarding competitiveness and global commodity chains, wage is one out of 20 factors that are relevant. Wages. No? So yes, it might be that in China wages have increased, and we have been doing work at the firm level regarding products and processes. No? So Siemens is today paying more for its automotive processes in Shanghai and Pudong. It's paying more than in Jalisco, by the way, not today, but 5 years ago, than in China than in Jalisco. No? This is 5 years ago. No? But this is not sufficient. I mean, for understanding why a firm sets up a plant somewhere, you have 20 other factors. And in the other 19, Mexico is not doing very well. Again, this is if you see specific issues. By the way, most critical and within NAFTA and for the United States is what is coming up in the auto parts and automobile sector. No, I would invite you to engage in this discussion that is going on, because just to have an idea, and with this I finish, but China today is producing 20 million cars. The United States 8.5, Mexico 2.5. No, and 30% of Chinese cars are made with Chinese brands. The rest are from other parts of the world. So we will have yesterday, not in 10 years, a clash there, I would say, in terms of competition that will affect the United States, Mexico, NAFTA, and many other issues. No? So I would say I would be cautious, no, regarding what is going on of employment maquiladoras, because we still have weaknesses of the last 10 years, and China not. No?
Thank you. Adriana, could you state and respond to the question that was posed to you?
So the question was about Brazil's position regarding WTO and TPP. Officially, I think the position is that Brazil is working, and would like to work even more towards the resolution of the Doha round, which of course is paralyzed. My sense is that there's ample recognition within government that this is at the very best a medium to long-term project. The obstacles are very large. For the case of Brazil, the disagreement over agricultural subsidies that are provided by the U.S. and Europe is a huge deal, and it turns out to be a cross-sector. I mean, the issue comes up with non-agricultural discussions too. But Brazil is already the most active player within WTO. It's the country that aciona, that starts the most processes. I think China is now the one that receives the most, not from Brazil necessarily, but Brazil, for instance, I think this morning I just read that Brazil is suing South Africa within WTO for tires, tire dumping. So I think the strategy of Brazil has been to work within the norms that have been established in general. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of talk about the Brazilian government imposing protectionist or semi-protectionist measures, as was in the case of cars, and this was clearly geared towards Asian producers, Asian exporters to Brazil, but also I think the U.S. ended up affected in general, the strategy has been to increase the tariffs up to the ceiling that is permitted by the WTO. And that's why the Brazilian government argues that this is not protectionism as such, because it's following the norms that are encoded. But I think, as I mentioned, this is the official position. I sense that there is growing awareness that Brazil can't place all of its eggs in the WTO 2.0 basket, because it's been paralyzed, and there's this proliferation of free trade agreements anyway arising outside, multilaterally and bilaterally. Within Asia, of course, the noodle bowl effect is very strong. At the same time, I'm quite critical right now, because I don't see a very coherent strategy of thinking systemically, including regarding the TPP. There are some people I talk to who believe that Brazil should seek a closer approximation with Europe, because the productive integration with Europe is much greater than with Asia. The chains, as Anika was saying, that's. I agree with you. There is not enough studies about this, but in general, people think that there's much more there across the sectors than there is with Asia. So trade with Asia remains important, but it remains fragmented, atomized, bilateral, and hence Brazil cannot pool the leverage necessary to conduct negotiations that would lead to a more, I think, expansion and a more balanced trade outside of the WTO regime.
Great, thank you, Adriana. Mauricio, could you state and respond to Cindy's question?
Thank you, Luis. Very briefly, the question was whether, given that Colombia is behind in its relationship with Asia, if there's an awareness within the country about the importance of reaching out for Asia. And the short answer is yes. But the complete answer, and it's very brief, I would identify 3 different dimensions. The first one is the academia and the government. For sure, the government and most of academics are very well, they know very well, we know very well that it's very important for the country in political as well as in economic terms to strengthen our links with the most dynamic area of the world economy today and for the first half of this century. That is for sure. We have to take into account, as Cindy said when she asked the question, that the 2 Álvaro Uribe administrations from 2002 to 2010 were centered in terms of the foreign policy in dealing with the US and the military cooperation of the US to fight the guerrillas in Colombia. Once that terrible stage is behind, hopefully in a definitive matter, we are trying to diversify our agenda with the rest of the world, and this impetus in dealing with Asia shows that. The second actor here is the private sector. Within the private sector, I would say that there are some fears, some concerns about how the Asian economies can hurt the domestic industry, the domestic manufacturing sector. And then there's a third dimension, which is the reality itself. I want to give you an example. For Colombia, it's much more difficult to deal with the infrastructure problems than with the foreign trade policy problems. It costs 3 times to take a container from Bogota to Barranquilla in the Caribbean coast than to take it from Barranquilla to Hong Kong at the other side of the world. So even though the government is trying to do some things, the academia is supporting those ideas, the private sector is a little bit frightened, the reality itself of the country has to do with having to undertake huge changes domestically in order to get inserted in the world economy and, of course, strengthening links with Asia.
Thank you so much. I think we're getting too close to our 1:10 closing time to have other questions, and it's always traditional at the Wilson Center to have closing remarks from the convener. Cindy?
Lou, thanks. Well, thanks to all of you for staying. Thanks especially to the presenters for truly, I think, remarkable and very rich papers and presentations. A special apology again to Mauricio and his colleague for the snafu yesterday at the airport. And I actually am embarrassed to say that I failed to acknowledge and thank Roberto Rosel of the Ditala University in Argentina, who is also the head of the Vidanta Foundation, who has really been the one who has made this whole exercise possible. So I would like to conclude, perhaps, and leave everyone with that sense of gratitude. Thank you once again. The papers will be up. They'll be revised. We will post these on the web, send them around via email, along with the emails of the various authors, so you'll have an opportunity to give comments or add reflections of your own. Thank you, Lou. Thank you all for the discipline and time, and I appreciate the participation of all of you. Thanks. And now, if you could help me in leaving the room quickly, but also taking your trash and papers and anything else, thank you.